Good afternoon, and welcome to Remaking the Economy, a guide to nonprofit roles and tools. I'm Steve Dubb, and I'm senior editor at Nonprofit Quarterly. And this webinar that we are doing is the first of a 7-session series on how civil society can participate in building a more democratic economy. And between now and May, we'll have sessions on community ownership of land, of capital, of employment, and more, and we hope you'll join us for those as well. So you'll be hearing about them more in follow-up emails and a little bit on this webinar in addition. We're pleased to be joined here by a number of guests. Debra Fries, author and co-founder of the Boston Impact Initiative, Maliki Kenyatta, activist, educator, and founder and director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, and Edgar Villanueva, Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation and author of a new and fantastic book called Decolonizing Wealth. We'll also be showing a video interview with Gar Alperovitz, who's a co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative. A few other notes before we get started. First, we're excited to be taking your questions, and we'll leave some time, at least 15-20 minutes, if not more, at the end of the webinar to allow panelists to answer them. Please enter any questions you have into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and I will share them with the panelists when we get to that part of today's discussion. Also, if we don't get to your question, and to be perfectly frank, it's impossible to get to everyone's question, please feel free to contact me. I'm at steve@mpqmag.org, and we'll do our best to follow up after the webinar. Second, we will be sharing the slides and the recording with everyone via email after the webinar. They'll probably come out a couple of days afterwards. Don't worry, we will make these materials available to you. And finally, we're happy to offer this webinar free of charge to our community. But of course, as we all know, these webinars are not free to produce. And you may notice that this webinar is not sponsored, or more to the point, it's being sponsored by NPQ. So we are really doing this on our own dime. And we did this because we felt the topics were so important we couldn't wait for sponsors. So if you can, please consider supporting NPQ today. After the webinar, there will be an email going out asking for a donation. We hope you see fit to do so. With that, thanks for being with us. We'll begin our conversation today by asking a couple of questions to see who's in the room. We'll start with, so a couple of polls. So start with this first question, which should come up now. And if you could just answer and say, what type of organization you work with, and we'll wait to get the responses. Okay, so 70% nonprofit, fair number of academia and philanthropy. It's too bad I can't ask the group, but I'm curious about some of the other responses. And, a lot of what we're talking about on this webinar is really going to be trying to provide a basis of understanding for the field. So we're glad to see so many people from the nonprofit sector here. Next question. Okay, so I see there's a lot of folks who are eager to learn, and please give us feedback both during this webinar and afterwards. And this is a series, so we really appreciate your thoughts about what we should be covering and how to move this discussion forward. So let me go to, I'll do a brief presentation talking about this series, and then we'll go to the interview with Gar Alperovitz. So first, just a brief introduction of what we're doing. So as I said, the series name is Remaking the Economy, and the focus of this set of these webinars really is to provide a base level understanding of community economic development, of what the tools are in the field, as well as an understanding of the position of our nonprofits within a political and economic system that in many ways is deteriorating or falling apart. And so, the common assumption in the nonprofit sector, and I've written about this, is that we do our logic model intervention. We go from A to B. Take a tutoring program. Hopefully, people at the end know more than they knew at the beginning. But you sort of make a background assumption everything else is okay. And we're suggesting that that might not be the right assumption to make. And so we're hoping to encourage thinking about how do you operate in a world where what seems solid and fixed is itself changing. So next slide. And here's one of the reasons why this is so important. These are fairly shocking figures. You'll notice that green sliver there, 1.9%, that's 60% of the US population. So the net worth of the bottom 200 million people in the country, roughly, because we have a population of about 325 million in the United States, so 60%, about 200 million, have only 2% of the wealth compared to the top 1% or 3 million who have close to 40% of the wealth. These are from National Federal Reserve figures that came out of the 2016 Survey of Consumer Finance, and they represent a shift toward increased inequality. So it used to be you could have a sliver for the bottom 40%, but at this point, the bottom 40% of the population actually have a negative net worth, so impossible to show on a pie chart. So, what is the role of nonprofits in this? So in a series that we did in the summer edition of the Nonprofit Quarterly, we started this discussion of building a democratic economy and what's involved. And one of the authors in that series is Doug Rushkoff, who some of you may know. And he talked about how nonprofits need to stop thinking of themselves as adjuncts to the market, but instead as a better form of doing business than for-profit companies. And so we're talking about the need to move from a sort of a mindset of charity or delivery of services, which is of course part of what nonprofits in fact do, to a more broad conception of being actors within the politics and economy of the society in which they exist. And so this is the overall overview of the series. So today we're going to provide an overview of Remaking the Economy. Each of the following sessions are going to focus on specific topics. So next one, and they're all on the second Thursday, all at 2 p.m. Eastern to 3:30 p.m. Eastern. So we're trying to make the times as consistent as possible. So hopefully you can put that on your calendar. We'll look at community capital and finance. February 14th. March 14th, we'll look at the role of hospitals and universities, which of course are the majority of our sector. We'll look at policy at the next to last one. And the last one's looking at success changing the system. And that one will actually be led by senior editor at Nonprofit Quarterly, Cindy Suarez. And we're going to look at Puerto Rico in particular as a community that, because of Maria, because of the bankruptcy, is actually not just at a rhetorical level, but in a live and real level, having to rebuild its economy and what's involved and what are the role of nonprofits at that. So rather than just talk about system change from a theoretical perspective, we wanted to get as practical as possible. Of course, Cindy, as some of you may have followed, has written a number of articles and been to on Puerto Rico and been to Puerto Rico twice in the past year. And so these are some of the overall learning objectives. We're going to look at what are the values of a more democratic economy. Clearly, redistribution of asset wealth developing capacity is part of that, but also a culture that builds that dismantles structural forms of oppression such as racism, patriarchy, and other forms of inequality. We'll hopefully be developing a toolkit of different tools, whether it's community land trusts, cooperatives, public banks, community development financial institutions, and so forth. What are the available mechanisms that can lead to more democratic outcomes? What are the support systems we need? What is the culture that we need in order to build a society that decolonizes wealth, that prioritizes racial equity? What can we do in terms of strategy or leverage? What kind of practices do we need, and last, how do we maintain balance, and really, I think we're gonna in this series we intend to be as pragmatic as possible. So we're recognizing the need for changing actual structures and systems, and at the same time, we know that that requires action here and now. So you have to be able to work on both levels, and that'll be a consistent theme, I think, in this series. So with that, I think that's the last slide. Next slide. We should go to the video with Gar Alperovitz, and then after that, we'll hear from the panelists. I'm Steve Dubb, Senior Editor at Nonprofit Quarterly, and we have with us Gar Alperovitz, historian, political economist, and co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative. Gar has been writing about economic change and political economy and history for a number of decades now, and wanted to bring him here to start this discussion about how do we think about economic systems and what is the role of nonprofits within that. So Gar, I thought I'd start by asking you just a broad question about, we can talk about systems a lot, and it can, but what do we mean by system change, and why is why system change at this time? Why do you see there being a possibility or for system change to actually occur? There's definitely a belief often that the system that we have in place is the system that we will always have in place.
Well, there's a lot of questions in that set of questions, Steve. So let me start by saying, as a historian, systems come and go. We live in the middle of an advanced corporate capitalist system, but it would be very surprising in very general terms if this system was the be-all and end-all of all time. So that's broad perspective, but I think there are reasons to believe that we are having the kind of period of transition towards a new system. And it may be a very ugly and violent transition. It may or may not be an easy transition. But I think we're reaching the end road of the corporate capitalist system we have as we now know it. So let me be careful about that. For a long period in the middle part of the 20th century and up till maybe the end of the century, as you know, I used to work in the House and Senate and high levels of the government. The system was essentially, and all systems involve who really owns the wealth. And the wealth is extremely concentrated in this country, both in terms of small elites and the corporations. And then the question becomes, how is that system of power managed? For much of the lifetime of the last half of the 20th century and early part of this century, it was a combination of activists, movement building, and the institution we call the labor union that gave countervailing power to manage the system against corporate power. And what's really interesting and kind of in many ways tragic about the current moment is that labor unions have essentially disappeared. They've gone from 34% of the labor force to about 6% in the private sector, so that the counterbalance to the corporate system is no longer there. So that's a very, very dangerous moment in history, but it is a design that is very weak over time because it doesn't answer the problems of everyday life for most people. If you look at the New Deal, much of the New Deal was created in experiments in the 1910s and 1920s, what we call Social Security, for instance. Many of the feminist programs began, many of the labor programs, pension programs. All of that was begun and developed in that period. And I think we're in a very similar period to move beyond where we were with corporate capitalism. So I think this is a very dangerous period. It's a very ugly period, but also, and I hear for the folks working in the nonprofit world, the work that's being done at the grassroots level can be very, very formative in producing groundwork ideas and programs and experiments that lay the groundwork for the next basis of a transformative system.
I guess one of the debates in the sector and maybe beyond, is so often the vision is that you can make reforms, so even Gar Alperovitz, in his book that just came out on on wealth, makes a very strong systemic critique. And my colleague Amy Costello actually did a podcast with him not long ago. But then he comes down and says, well, what we need are, reforms that will, make the system more equitable. You, however, are suggesting that the change has to be more thorough than that just simply adding, redistributive reforms will not actually solve the problems that are leaving so many disenfranchised.
I would even go further than that. I think that it's not possible to go much farther down that direction. And let me outline it very briefly. The muscle power that made those kinds of reforms possible, that is taxing the wealthy and building up programs for low and moderate income people, the New Deal, the post-New Deal, the social programs, that depended on a counter institution to the corporation. And it was American labor unions as part of the coalition. It was an institution. Labor unions have essentially disappeared. They've gone to 6% of the labor force in the private sector, and they're going down further. So there is need to build up, and here's where the nonprofit world really is critical, counter institutions that begin to suggest a very different direction and build political power. What's happening at the grassroots level, and this is exciting, I think we're beginning slowly but surely to build up all kinds of counter institutions that may be the basis of the next transformation. So what I'm thinking of is worker co-ops being one part of it, some very dramatic forms in Cleveland, which are complex forms of community and worker ownership, public banking, land trusts. The development of institutional power of that kind is a precondition of a new politics that is both political, but gets its muscle from having developed from the ground up. And I think that's where we are in an early phase of development, but a very exciting and important phase, because what's going on at the grassroots level is quite dramatic.
Thanks. So just to push that a little bit, what does it take to change the system, and how do social movements, Black Lives Matter or Occupy and its children, interact with these institutions like co-ops and other forms of economic organization?
Obviously, that's the critical question. Over time, how we build the combination of what I sometimes call walking on two legs, building political power through social movements, but also simultaneously working to build institutional power at the grassroots level. So we're beginning to see experiments like that in some cities and some towns, where we get folks both challenging environmental questions and challenging climate change, but also building new energy programs, building new public banks, building land trusts, doing both at the same time. And the third piece of that, which has not yet developed in many communities, is developing a theory and vision of what's going on. So I think we're in the early phase, both in the experiments and in self-political education, about what the next decade or the next decade beyond can look like if we attempt systematically to project a vision of where all this goes and how we see the work at the grassroots level. We're not there yet. We're at the beginning phase of that development, but you can see it in many, many communities. But the processes that are creating new activists and new institutions at the local level, that combination, that's a powerful combination if you see it historically, rather than why didn't it happen yesterday, but you see a buildup over time. And that's the perspective I'd like to suggest.
Thanks, Gar. Let me push a little bit on this walking with two legs idea. So, I mean, there's the building up the experiments and the social movements, and then there's just the, I'll call it survival ethos. So there are 1,000 people a year, majority of whom are Black, who are shot down, by police. These are the numbers, right? There are, millions without health insurance. There's trauma. It has to be really concrete in terms of stopping the bleeding in some cases. And so, what do you have any advice for nonprofits sort of struggling with this? Because I think a lot of people in the sector do. Understanding the need for systemic change and the need to make a difference right now.
Look, I totally agree with you. And the pain levels in some parts of, I'm from Wisconsin originally, in some parts of particularly rural Wisconsin, and sort of Milwaukee, certain parts of the city are really ugly. And I think conditions are going to get worse. So in this context, obviously, first priority is to do whatever can be done, but it's often limited what can be done. And second, simultaneously building institutions and institutional political power. And the third piece, and I think people have, in only a few communities have begun to think about it, actually educating ourselves about what a long-term trajectory of change could look like, beginning to think as historical actors about what is it really going to take to turn around the most powerful corporate capitalist system in the history of the world. And that way of thinking and strategizing and self-educating, I think, is critical. I remember, I remember way back when the beginnings of the women's movement started, and there was enormous self-education as well as activism. And I think those two pieces haven't quite gelled yet. But I think that mix, do what you need to do as best you can, begin building new democratically owned institutions, but self-educating politically. So we've got a lot of development and experimenting to do, and building a politics around that, and self-education. I want to underline that. We haven't quite reached that, beginning to really debate. I mean, I'm a great fan of the women's movement. In the early period, they used to say, how do you get power? Where does power come from? Get a group of half a dozen friends or 10 friends, get some pizza and something to drink, whatever you like, begin to read and debate, and then decide what you can do locally and act together with a framework of strategy. And I think that self-education political process is going to be necessary in this period as well. Mr. Trump is making it very clear that we're going to have to do some unusual things. Otherwise, he's going to clear the board. So I think the time, and what's exciting about it, a lot of people are beginning to act in new ways.
All right. Well, I could continue with many more questions, but I want to thank you, Gar, for your time, and we'll move back to the webinar. But thanks so much for your contribution.
Well, thanks to the Quarterly. It's been terrific what you folks have been doing. So I'm, as you know, an avid reader.
So I'm Debra Fries with the Boston Impact Initiative. And we are a nonprofit charitable loan fund working to close the racial wealth divide in Eastern Massachusetts. And the conversation that I'm going to offer for just a few minutes here is actually a little bit of a map related to what Gar was just speaking about. And what I've learned over the past 15 years as a student of systems thinking is that it is actually the nature of living systems to self-organize around a set of values and beliefs. And so if we want to participate in supporting the transition from an economic system that self-organizes around extraction and exploitation, our corporate capitalist system, to one that self-organizes around regeneration and solidarity, then we have to examine the beliefs we hold about how capital and power are distributed in that system. And that's the map I want to offer. So let's go to the next slide and look at a general way of understanding how systems change. So I would say all systems simply rise, peak, and move into decline. That's the nature of a system, whether it's an ecological system, a political system, a technical system. And at some point, usually around the peak, we see signs of turbulence, disruptions in supply, spikes in demand, volatility in pricing. And that's when alternatives start to appear. We can go to the next slide. I call these alternatives walkouts. They're people who turn their back on the dominant system because they don't agree with the values and the beliefs that are expressed in it, and they walk on to create something new. Now, if these individual walkouts, if their efforts remain isolated from one another, then nothing can happen. The dominant system is going to come in and crush, absorb, or co-opt those pioneers because every living system is inclined towards self-preservation. But if they get connected to one another, exchanging information and learning, then their separate efforts can suddenly emerge as a powerful system capable of disrupting the old order and giving birth to something new. And this sort of dangerous time that Gar talked about that we're living in, I think we're in this moment where we are past the peak of many of our dominant systems, and we're not yet in a robust place with the emergence of the new. So we're in this crazy time where we're in this shift from industrial agriculture to local and organic food, from fossil fuel, the old system, to renewable energy, and certainly in the question of the economy. So I would call the dominant system, you might call it Wall Street casino capitalism, right? The extractive economy, what David Korten calls the dying suicide economy. And it's organized around the values of profit maximization, resource extraction, growth, and efficiency, all measured through quarterly returns. And in that system, the one that we've got as our dominant system, the accumulation of money is at the center of everything we do. The second loop, the green one that's emergent, tells a very different story. We might call this one the regenerative economy, the local living economy, the solidarity economy. And it is organized around the well-being of people and place. This system is designed to encourage the flow rather than the accumulation, storage, and hoarding of resources between people and a community. And that's part of the reason why I'm so interested in systems thinking, because nature becomes our teacher, where we learn about how systems flow in nature. So the bigger dynamic that I believe going on, if we go to the next slide, is a shift from an economics of separation to an economics of relationship. So the economics of separation is basically the American dream, the so-called American dream writ large, right? It's the myth that we are rugged individualists, right? Our biological reality is survival of the fittest. That competition is humanity's natural state, which means that there are those of us who are smarter and work harder and therefore earn what we gain, and everyone else is lazy and less capable and needs our help, which gives rise to a lot of philanthropy, right? That he who wins, I use he on purpose, he who wins gets the right to accumulate, and nature is here to serve our needs and support our growth, right? And this economics of separation has given rise to this ever widening gap between the haves and the have-nots throughout the globe, in our country and everywhere. And I'm not saying that it's false. There are aspects of this that are true. It describes part of who we are, but it does not describe all of who we are. So next slide. What if instead of being fundamentally competitive, selfish, and separate, right, we are by nature cooperative, generous, and independent and interdependent. And so an economics of relationship says that we are by nature interdependent, that we're concerned about opportunity and well-being for all, that rather than focus on competition, we're inclined toward cooperation, that resources are meant to flow through us. So in nature, accumulation is often stagnation, and that we turn toward nature as our teacher, right? And there have been studies from the Greater Good Science Center and others that show that if you give a person resources, they're inclined to give more than 50% right away. That in fact, who we are as a species is hyper-connected, interdependent, and engaged in the interests of others, right? We want to be in relationship with each other. So if we're gonna make this shift from an economics of separation to an economics of relationship, there's a lot of inner work to do, and there's a lot of outer work to do in the way that we design and structure our system. So there's a lot more to say about that, but my work is about experimenting in building an investment fund that uses both investment capital, impact investing, and grant capital based on the economics of relationship. We're considering how capital moves and who has the power to make decisions about where it goes. So as we're experimenting with this shift, I want to offer one last thing, which is 4 roles that we can play to support the shift. So next slide. We're going to be in this dynamic and this tension between coexisting systems for a long time to come, I believe, as we cling, and we're seeing, of course, in the administration today, we're seeing the clinging on, or you might say the death throes of the dying system, which is in its decline, and this wrestling with the emergence of the new. And so we need to play in all parts of the system at large scale for the shift to occur. So the role that people often get all fired up about, right, are the trailblazer. Those are those walkout folks who are creating new experiments like Gar spoke about, right? People working with cooperatives and land trusts, with worker self-directed nonprofits, right? Participatory budgeting, all kinds of solidarity activities, solidarity economics, solidarity philanthropy, experimenting locally on the ground, exchanging learning with each other, and helping give rise to this new system. Simultaneously, we need people who are staying inside big systems, providing hospice, meaning providing loving care to those who are suffering because of the failures of the dominant system, right? As you give loving care to someone who knows they're dying. So being a hospice worker may mean staying in places that are part of the economics of separation and administering care, providing food aid, right? Providing support, advocacy support for immigrants, things, all kinds of people who are suffering in our current system that continue to need our love and compassionate care. That's the hospice worker. The illuminators are the storytellers, the folks who make visible the choice, right? Things like what MPQ is doing right now, that there's a way of doing work inside big systems, but there are all these experiments happening outside, and we need to make that visible so many more can join in. And finally, there's a critical role for people who have power in the dominant system, power, control of resources, and influence, and we call those the protectors. They use their authority and their power in the dominant system to support the work of trailblazers and illuminators so they can move things forward. Because without that protection and support, that first thing I said, that the dominant system will try to crush or absorb or co-opt the pioneers, they need protection, they need financial resources, they need policy advocacy, they need folks in power to support the shift. So I think you'll have a chance in a bit to reflect on where you might place yourself, but these are the roles that are needed for some of the system shift that we're hoping to build a solidarity economy.
Peace. This is Maliki Yakini with the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. It's an honor to be on this webinar today with people who are thinkers about how we create a system that is more geared for human beings and respect for nature. And also greetings to all the people who are participating in the webinar who are doing this work on a community level. I'd like to talk to you first about the work of the organization that I lead, the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. Next slide. We're very concerned about the economy in general, but about the food economy in particular, because the reality is the food economy is the first economy of any community. People typically eat daily, maybe sometimes multiple times a day, and there's usually some money exchange that takes place as people obtain that money, that food. And so what we find in Detroit, a city that is predominantly African-American, about 83% African-American, we find that other ethnic groups come into our community, own the grocery stores, and really extract the wealth from the Black community and take it into their communities. And so we're very concerned about how we begin to capture that wealth that we are generating and how we circulate that wealth in our community as opposed to the extractive model that typically happens. So one of the things that we're doing in the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network is we operate a farm, a 7-acre farm called D-Town Farm. And we're at that farm training people with the skills and knowledge necessary to grow food, which is a necessary component of this food economy, this localized food economy. The other thing that we do is that we have a youth program called the Food Warriors Youth Development Program that functions at one school and one church in the city of Detroit. That program is designed to involve young people in the food movement. One of the things I learned as an activist who's been involved in this movement for many years is that in order for the movement to be sustainable, we have to intentionally reach out to young people. When I was younger and first becoming involved in the late 60s and early 1970s, we were under the misconception that it was going to be a dramatic shift in power in the United States within the next 2 or 3 years. We now understand that that's a much more protracted process. And while we're creating this system that we envision, this more just system that we envision, we have to figure out how to navigate through the system that we're in now. So in order to create this long-term change, again, we have to intentionally reach out to young people, and we do that through our Food Warriors Youth Development Program. The photo you see on the right side of the screen is a young lady at our school-based program holding some of the garlic that they grew 2 years ago. And we're a little jealous because actually the garlic that the children grew at the school was larger and more robust than the garlic that we grew at D-Town Farm. Next slide. The big project that we're working on now is called the Detroit Food Commons and the Detroit People's Food Co-op. And let me give a little context. So I already mentioned how the vast majority of the stores in the city of Detroit are owned by ethnic groups other than African Americans, which is the dominant population. And I mentioned how the wealth is extracted through those stores. But also what we're seeing in Detroit, people hear all the time about the comeback of Detroit or the renaissance of Detroit. And what is being pointed to as symbols of this comeback are the large number of new buildings that are being built in downtown Detroit and the area that has been recast as Midtown Detroit, and a few other areas. And these areas are areas that, not coincidentally, are strongholds of young whites who are moving back into the city. They're the areas in the city that are the most highly gentrified. And so what we're seeing as the kind of development model in Detroit is new construction being done mostly by wealthy white men. And I intentionally use that phrase because it speaks to both class, race, and gender, which are three of the ways that that oppression is carried out in the United States. So most of this development is being led by wealthy white men. And I guess the theory of the elected and appointed officials in the city of Detroit seems to be that if you allow wealthy white men to get tax breaks and to buy land at a pittance, that somehow the wealth they generate by building stadiums and other large edifices will somehow trickle down to the rest of us. So we have no confidence that that has ever worked historically or that it will work in the future. So in the face of that type of development, we think it's important that we advance a model that really promotes cooperative economics, which we think within the context of a capitalist system is the only way that we have to galvanize our collective wealth, to build really grassroots people's democracy, and also to build community ownership and empowerment. And so we're developing a cooperative grocery store right on the main street of Detroit, Woodward Avenue, in an area of town called the North End. And that grocery store will be a full service grocery store owned by member owners. We're also building the building that that grocery store will be located in. That building is called the Detroit Food Commons. And so we're working very hard to bring this into existence because, again, we think it's an alternative to the kind of development that we see in the city of Detroit currently. And part of the work of a co-op is really raising the consciousness of people about the benefits of working together for the common good. Next slide. So we have some real impediments as we think about how we build a fair and just non-extractive economy. And the biggest of those problems are capitalism and white supremacy. And of course, those systems are intersecting, and they tend to concentrate wealth in the hands of people who already have wealth, who typically are, again, white men. In fact, what we've seen as we try to find financing, try to find the rest of the financing for this project that we're working on, is that the way capitalism works is that if you have assets, then you are better positioned to get financing. Banks are not going to lose. And so if they loan you money, they want to make sure that you have collateral. And so those who have the collateral are those who already tend to be wealthy. So capitalism is a self-replicating system that continues to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few and has historically and continues to box out African Americans and others from the mainstream economy. We are seen in the context of this economy much like colonies were seen during the era of imperialism, where the colonial country was seen as a source of labor or source of resources that could be extracted from the ground. And so in similar fashion, the resources from our community are extracted in order to make additional wealth for those who already have it. Next slide. So our organization believes that in order to make significant change, that we have to have a fundamental redistribution of wealth, both a redistribution of land and also a redistribution of money. And so we don't think the kind of incremental, very small incremental change is really going to change, make the kind of fundamental change that we need to make. And so we need to look at land distribution as other countries have done, both the rural countryside, where much of the food is grown, and we know, of course, that Black farmers are continuing to lose land at an enormous rate. We need to look at how we redistribute land on the countryside, but also in urban areas where we're seeing gentrification of areas that are predominantly Black and brown. We need to develop policies so that the residents of those communities can have ownership of the communities that they're in. And then ultimately, because much of the wealth of the Western world was built on the backs of Africans who were enslaved, and those enslaved Africans or the descendants have never been compensated for that wealth, that there needs to be reparations. And there's lots of arguments about how that reparation should best be paid. But the fact of the matter is that there has to be some redistribution of the wealth that was created because of the labor and the creativity of enslaved Africans so that their descendants can live healthy and prosperous lives. Thank you, and I'm going to pass the mic on.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Edgar Villanueva. I'm the Vice President of Programs at the Schott Foundation for Public Education. And as Steve mentioned earlier, I have a new book out called Decolonizing Wealth. I'm honored to be on this webinar, and it was really interesting to hear the presentations now and how my thoughts are connecting. I see the thread here, Steve, and how you all brilliantly paired these conversations together. In my book, I highlight what I call dysfunctional colonial dynamics that are at play in philanthropy and finance, and I offer a prescription for restoring that balance and healing divides, bringing indigenous wisdom that has been passed down to me as a Native American in this space, and also that has been shared with me from elders from my community and other communities. The ultimate takeaway here is that institutions that move and control money are broken, and that money, the accumulation of wealth, has been used historically to divide and exploit people and the land rather than supporting well-being. And this applies to all institutions, whether you're in philanthropy, banking, finance, social impact investing. All of these colonial dynamics are underlying the work that's happening, creating divisions of us versus them, haves versus have-nots, white saviors and white experts versus poor, needy, urban, disadvantaged, marginalized, at-risk people. Take your pick of euphemisms for people of color. So we all know that when it comes to getting access to money, getting access to capital, that white folks, usually white men, are in charge, and then people of color are in the position to have to seek out this money and are often declined because we're not seen as having enough capital, or we're seen as being a risky investment by mainstream funders. And so what I'm highlighting, connecting to the previous presentation, is we definitely, I would just want to reassert that capitalism and neoliberalism are absolutely problems and are not working for everyone. But what is really conveniently kind of hiding behind capitalism is the notion of white supremacy. And as Malcolm X said, you can't have capitalism without racism. Next slide, please. So briefly, I want to just touch on this word of colonization. 500 years ago, a virus touched the shores of this country, and that virus was colonization. And we often think of that word as something from 500 years ago, but the dynamics of colonization continue to erode our economy and our communities today. And the dynamics of colonization are really the mantra of divide and conquering, commanding and controlling, and exploitation of land and people. And so we see what I call the colonizing virus continue to show up in our policies and in our systems and in our culture, in our institutions. And so we are often talking about in philanthropy various kinds of reforms. And where, such as long-term general operating support and looking at tax law. And, these types of reforms are certainly valid, but I see them as effective as rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, because I think we have to really examine more difficult types of questions that are related to colonization. Who has money? Who is actually has the power to make decisions about where capital and money is being invested in communities? Where is money being allocated? Who gets to control it? Who gets to spend it? Spend that money. And so we know, for example, foundations sit on $800 billion of assets, and that only about 8% of grant making, which is a fraction of the $800 billion in the bank, only 8% of grant making is going into communities of color. And so we have a major disparity that is contributing to the race wealth gap. So in the book, I talk about decolonizing wealth. And so I just want to quickly talk about what I mean by decolonization. Decolonization literally means the process of undoing colonization. So the mantra of dividing and exploiting, extracting, separating, dividing, all of those things, decolonization is undoing that. Taken literally, decolonization means that the land that was stolen is returned, sovereignty over all of the land and its resources, the social structures and traditions, all of that is returned to to those from whom it was all stolen. However, decolonization defined as a political process like that often tends to get stuck. And I actually think that there is no reality, in the 21st century where settlers and colonizers and those who have been colonized, where we're not all actually integrated at this point. Our businesses, our families, we are, kind of living with what we have at this moment. But what we can do when we're thinking about decolonization is actually understand the trauma that has been caused by this process of colonization. Because colonization violates us and it leaves this trauma that we're still dealing with. And that's actually true whether you are colonized, whether you're indigenous or a person of color, but also if you are the colonizer, which is another topic for another day. But what we can focus on with decolonization is actually stopping the cycles of abuse, healing ourselves in order to expand possibilities that are more equitable for everyone. This means getting to a place of understanding that our interdependence is inescapable and acknowledging the trauma that exists in communities and engaging in a healing process together. So in the book, I talk about money as being medicine. And what do I mean by medicine? Medicine is an indigenous concept that is anything that helps to restore balance, facilitate healing, and bring about, restoration. And so I actually think that we can think differently about money and resources, rather than looking back at the history and of the accumulation of wealth and the trauma that accumulation has played. I think we could flip that and think about reallocating resources and those who control the flow of resources using money as medicine, which means putting money into communities where the harm has been the worst and where the hurt has been the worst. And I think that gets to some of the notions of reparations and absolutely moving money into communities of color, because money should be a tool of love to help facilitate relationships and to help us thrive, not to be a tool that further causes harm and division in our communities. Next slide, please. And so in the second part of the book, I won't get into this now, I do describe a process of healing from the trauma that is central to decolonization. So, it starts with acknowledging our woundedness. That is key. And then I go through several other steps that you can see in the slide, which are grieving, apologizing, listening, relating, representing, investing, and repairing. And so these are steps to healing that have come from my personal experience, that have come from folks that are healers and who do healing work in communities. And I've applied these concepts to organizations that move and control money. And so as funders, as grant makers, or investors, or folks who are working in government that allocate resources, this is a step that you can go through, steps that you can go through to acknowledge the trauma that has been caused by the accumulation of wealth, and to think about how you can be a leader or someone who is helping to build an economy that is more reciprocal and in solidarity with communities versus further extraction. Turning back to you, Steve.
All right, well, hopefully we'll all show up here. So let's see, get all four of us maybe, Edgar. So I'm about to go to questions, but before we do, I thought we'd do one last poll. And you'll recall those four categories that Debra Frieze mentioned. So let yourself decide, where do you fit best. And I know that many of us can probably do a little. Oh, there we go. We get the result, maybe. Oh, well, that's really interesting. So that's a huge number of illuminators, and so it looks like we all are in different roles, and and as Deborah was talking about, all of those roles are absolutely necessary. So let's end the poll and moving on. So I thought I'd start with a question. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then I'm going to go to the audience. And let me just, I put this in the chat. I'll emphasize it also now. Be thinking of your own questions and start typing them now. And I'm going to, as soon as I start getting questions typed in, I'm going to start asking your questions, not just our own. So, but I did want to start with Malik, and you brought up the issue of reparations, and in the context of your work, in Detroit and with food systems, what does that look like, and how are reparations part of a broader vision of creating a fundamental shift in power? So we're not just as community groups fighting over crumbs, but actually, solving problems and building a more equitable society.
The work that we're doing now primarily probably fits more into the fighting over crumbs category. Our group, like most nonprofits, are constantly chasing grants. And, what we find even in the grant world, similarly to what I was talking about financing, is that those organizations that tend to get the larger grants are those that are deemed by foundations as having the most capacity. And so the groups that generally have the most capacity are older, more well-established, often white-led nonprofits. And so nonprofits being led by people of color are often scrambling for smaller grants, trying to constantly piece those together, trying to make sure from year to year we're able to keep our staff on board. So, several of us are thinking about this concept called equitable food-oriented development, and how we might meet with foundations to get them to rethink some of their funding strategies, including how they might provide longer-term funding for nonprofits, how they might think about changing some of the evaluation criteria so that it really aligns more with what the people doing the work see as being important to evaluate. So that's kind of where we are now. But in terms of the larger systems change, we're completely convinced that that reparations for African people of African descent in the United States, is absolutely necessary to begin to even think about evening the playing field. We know that now in the United States that the average white family has 13 to 14 times the wealth of the average black family. We're not going to even that playing field just by kind of the programs, the Band-Aid programs that nonprofits are often able to implement. So this has to happen on the federal level, and Detroit has a very strong history of having participated in the struggle for reparations and advocated for that, with Congressman John Conyers introducing a bill each year for maybe 25 years or so, trying to get the House to buy into this concept of paying reparations to African Americans.
Malika, could you say a little bit more about what are there specific mechanisms? You could just write a check to each person, or it could be more community focused. How are you thinking about it?
Various theories about how that might take place, and I don't want to advocate for one or the other. But on one level, some people advocate every person who can prove that they're a descendant of an enslaved African just getting a check. There are others who say that if that strategy were used, that ultimately that money would still end up with the dominant culture, because we would still be in a position of being consumers and would spend that money and still wouldn't have long-term empowerment. There are those who are advocating that there be free education, free higher education for African Americans as a way of leveling the playing field. And then there are those who believe that there are community-based organizations that should get infusions of cash that they can then redistribute to create programs and communities that empower the residents of those communities. And there may be other strategies as well. And so there needs to be a vigorous national debate about exactly how that takes place. But I think what's important now is we establish the legitimacy of the claim by many African Americans for reparations.
Yeah, thanks, Malik. That's helpful. Edgar, you were talking about trauma and healing, and these are tough issues, right? And this so there's a lot of interactions in that are sort of more transactional. You make a grant from a foundation, there's a nonprofit gets the grant, they spend the money, you do something. And you were talking about, when we were talking earlier about, building something that's more transformational. So how do you achieve some of that? And and just to make it a little more difficult, like why shouldn't we just do incremental changes? That seems straightforward. We know what we're doing. What's lacking that needs to change?
That's a great question. I'll try to respond briefly. I do believe in incremental change. That's one approach to change. I do not believe in investing as a funder incrementally. And I think, when we're looking at the deep social problems that we're trying to change, many of us as funders, they did not come about quickly. It's hundreds of years of oppression that have led to poverty and education disparities and health disparities and all the things we're looking at. And so it's really going to take a long-term commitment to fix these things. We cannot undo colonization that's been 500 years in the making with a silver bullet. It's just impossible. And so I think that it's what I'm inviting folks to do is one, to be aware that the healing is necessary, right? That we have a history that requires that we understand it and sit in it and grieve it and acknowledge it in order to have that inform our funding practices. I think what white dominant culture often wants to do is not acknowledge that and to just sprinkle some money at the problem, because if we deeply connect with the transgressions that have happened in this country, we're going to be compelled to engage with community in a different way that is a lot more reciprocal versus transactional. Often the transactional approach is, I think, because people are afraid. They're afraid of acknowledging the pain that they may have been a part of inflicting. And so we sit over in our ivory towers and send checks over here without engaging on a one-to-one, a human level.
Got it. Thanks, Edgar. Deborah, I wanted to ask you about the vantage point from philanthropy and impact investing, and that's of course what you're working in. And there's a theory out there. It's still the dominant approach, frankly. That what the foundation should do is invest in the market, get the best return that they can. That allows for more money to go out in grants, and you're arguing for a very different approach. So talk about how to make impact investing not just sort of, I don't know, a kind of greenwashing, if you will, but actually impactful. And if you have time, maybe reflect. I mean, you and I both come from the dominant culture, right? And so there's a sense of of assuming responsibility and a different vantage point from which you're making your investments as well.
Well, so there's this very, very popular narrative, right, that you can do well by doing good and you don't have to sacrifice anything, and it's a win-win, some of which has been popularized in Anangir Dodasi's book, Winners Take All. I'm with him. It's a delusion. Edgar just said, you can sprinkle some money at the problem and feel better about it. That is actually the fundamental root problem, I think, in philanthropy and in now impact investing. Is now we're all investing to change the world, which is there's a way in which that part of the impact investing world and philanthropy is colluding in a white supremacist economic model, because all of the power and the capital has accrued to the wealthy, to white folks, but mostly who are in control of everything. And then the generosity of philanthropy and the social good of changing your impact investing portfolio to one that is for the climate and maybe a little bit for social change actually upholds this white supremacist economic system. And so thinking that on the one hand, I can give my 5% away of philanthropy, and on the other hand, I'll put my 95% on Wall Street, make as much money as I can to ensure that I can give the 5% away, is staying attached to the economics of separation, where power and control has accrued to where it has accrued and stays there. And out of the good of our generous, usually progressive and somewhat liberal hearts, we are reallocating the capital, but not reallocating the power. And again, it's a fraction of the capital. So one of the things I talk to impact investors about is like, okay, if you say that you care about soil and you only care about soil and you want to maximize your return, like I could get on that as well, but I'm going to not tackle that as much as I am. If you say that you care at all about inequality and you care at all about the wealth divide and the racial wealth divide in this country and the history that got us here, you cannot be seeking market rate returns. By their nature, market rate returns for the 1% increase the wealth divide. That is the design of the economic system. So I think it's really important for philanthropy and for foundations to take a good hard look at that belief system, because no matter how generous you are, no matter how participatory maybe you even get with the 5% that you're allocating, you're still fundamentally upholding the system. And so the thing I say as a person with privilege, which is there's no way around this. White folks have to actually contract their wealth and give up power. And I don't mean give it up, sacrifice. I mean, like, let it flow. This is why I talk about accumulation versus flow. It has to flow. In a healthy ecological system, resources flow from where they've accumulated to where they've been needed most. So we should practice like nature and start to let that happen.
Great. Thanks, Deborah. Edgar, so in your book you talk about that I'm going to paraphrase, but basically, you're in philanthropy and you still love philanthropy and you have hope for philanthropy, I think is something like what you said. And so, we're talking about economic democracy here. Philanthropy is an important institution within the economy. Can it be democratized? And communities empowered, and maybe talk a little bit about how that, I think Malika mentioned this too, how it plays out in something like evaluation.
I mean, we have to be able to imagine that it can, that it can fundamentally change and be more democratic. The resources are where they are currently, and so yes, I work on the inside of the system, hoping to be a part of disrupting to create that flow that Deborah talked about. And so, I've accepted that that's my calling in medicine, is to be, a change maker from inside. And, I do feel hopeful and encouraged because we're having conversations like this that even 3 years ago, I don't know if I imagined that we would be having, that we would be saying white supremacy when we're talking about philanthropy, that we would be having open conversations about what foundations are doing with their 95%, that we would be questioning the net value of philanthropy. So that makes me hopeful, and I think that having these types of conversations on an ongoing basis are going to continue to turn on the light. In the meantime, I think that there's work that needs to be funded, and movement and nonprofit organizations that depend on these resources. And so I think helping folks see incremental ways that they can begin to change their policies and practices at foundations to be less oppressive to organizations. So you mentioned evaluation, Steve. I think, evaluation, I think, has been weaponized in a lot of cases. I see that it can be used as a tool that is helpful, but also a tool that further perpetuates the issues that we're talking about today. One, we have to look at who is even getting in the door in the first place to get resources. And then often, I think our own biases around who we consider to be experts, who we lift up in terms of having capacity, who's defining what capacity is, right? And so all of those can play out in how a foundation, decides to continue to supporting an organization. And so we've created this crazy game where we have these super crazy standards, nonprofits are pushing to meet those standards, and that are just unrealistic in many cases. So I think evaluation is a place where these equity interventions that we're talking about can actually be, there's a lot of room for implementation there, and I'm happy to talk with folks about that later.
Okay, thanks, Edgar. So just in the interest of full disclosure, we have plenty of questions among ourselves, and all of you who are participating in the webinar, who are listening, please do type your own questions and we will ask them. So moving on though, I think Deborah, you predicted that nobody would choose hospice, but actually 15% did. So it wasn't the high, it was, it came in fourth, but there was a significant percentage of people who said, yes, that is what I do. So, how, if you're working within an organization where you're, I don't know, working at a food bank or some kind of, clear hospice type situation, how can you be a trailblazer within that organization, and what do you have to pay attention to if you're doing that?
Okay, so I want to name something, because there is always a dynamic that is like, how do we all become trailblazers? And we are not all meant to be trailblazers. So thankfully, I think there are personality traits that fit. So like, trailblazers are like willing to be isolated and alone and pointed to as crazy and to fail a lot. And that does not suit every person's personality. And hospice workers are patient and loving and generous and caring and are willing to sit with the cold face of suffering and be heart open with it, right? And so if I'm working at a food bank and that is what I fit doing because I have that in my nature, that's beautiful work. It's necessary work. The trailblazers cannot do anything if there aren't people kind of working the existing system and making it less bad. So just to really honor the roles that are in the system. And if you're inside of a big organization that feels like it's doing hospice work and your call is to be under the radar, bringing trailblazing into it. So two thoughts. One is non-attachment, because these are big, complex, emergent systems that have been built around a set of beliefs that are usually tacit. And that's not your mission and vision. Your mission and vision sound good, but the underlying beliefs are competition, accumulation, individualism, and et cetera. And so that's the water we swim in our culture. And so usually it's infusing any big organization and a lot of small ones, but certainly the bigger ones. So when you bring trailblazing in, one is don't be attached to getting people to get it. Do your work. Like go ahead and do your work and find other trailblazers to do your work, right? So you can still see that the dominant system may attempt to shut you down and find undercover ways of doing it. Two, test yourself, because you may call it trailblazing work, and if you haven't looked inside to see what belief systems are operating within you, I think that's really where we have to do the inner work, especially if we've come from the oppressor side of the culture, to look at, am I actually still operating out of individualism and competition? Or am I really operating in solidarity where perhaps I'm willing to be unseen? I'm willing to give up power. I'm willing to find others to lift up and to build reciprocity with. So I think a lot of it is like an inner check and non-attachment, which means like sit down and meditate or you're not going to get through it.
Great, thanks, Deb. Malik, so one of the questions, one of the main debates right now, or I don't know, it's been with us always, is the challenge of racial equity and equality and racial justice, and there's both a need to work on that at an organizational level and a personal level, and how when we're talking about economic development work, but how do you think about an anti-race, being an anti-racist organization within that frame?
So I think the first thing, Gar talked about the need for study, which I think is extremely important, because there's a tendency in the society for us to become ahistorical and to not really look at the historic causes that brought us to this point, because that history is not pretty at all. But if we're going to really attack the root causes of inequality in the society, then we have to really have a profound understanding of that history. And so I think it's incumbent upon us as individuals to do that, but also for organizations to have a historical analysis so that their analysis of the present is rooted in the realities that history has caused. So we have this this systemic work that we're all engaged in, trying to kind of nudge the current system towards something that is closer to justice and equity. And that's perhaps the easiest of the two kinds of work. The other more difficult work is what Deborah just talked about, which is this internal work, which we constantly have to do. Because if we don't do the internal work, we'll maybe switch power, but we'll replicate the same kind of values that are guiding the current system. And so ultimately, we have to, as the Detroiter Grace Boggs often talked about, we have to really create ourselves as new human beings. We have to redefine what it means to be a human being, particularly in this time period. So that means that we have to do an inventory of our values and the things that shape how we see the world and how we see ourselves. One of the things that the system of white supremacy does is that, of course, for white people, it suggests that they're the best thing since sliced bread. And I sometimes say the evil twin sister of white supremacy is Eurocentricity, which leads us to believe that everything that's good and of value in the world was created by white people. And so that bolsters people who are considered to be white and gives them this sense that they have the responsibility of saving the rest of humanity. And there are many other kind of side effects of this kind of internalized sense of superiority. But for Black people and other people of color, we have an internalized sense of inferiority. And so we have to constantly be working on that, kind of getting rid of those antiquated ideas and filling our head with the ideas that affirm who we are, affirm the cultures and the history that we're part of, so that we can move forward in the world as whole, healthy, complete human beings.
Great, thanks. So one of the questions that we're starting to get some audience questions, so I'm going to read one of these out. So, how can we interlink the work we're doing in smaller projects, with the true parallel economy? So I think, Deborah, you talked about how there's sort of these two tracks. There's both the dying of the existing system and the emerging of a new system. So, how does this actually play out in your work? And Malika and Edgar, if you want to jump in, please feel free to do so. But I'll start with that.
Sure. I mean, I think about it like, we need fossil fuel to manufacture solar panels. All right. So we need to not ignore the assets of the dominant system. So in my field, in the world of impact investing, we are using the tools of capitalism, right? We are using debt structures of investing and equity structures of investing in order to direct capital to entrepreneurs of color so they can own and control buildings, land, and the means of production. So the thing is, we've got to reinvent those tools. So for example, when we do equity investment, we're doing equity investments not in order to make money off of the entrepreneurs, because the idea if you're trying to close the wealth divide, you want them to own the equity. We're doing it because equity is necessary on a balance sheet to run a business effectively in the economy. So how do we transition equity back to the owners and back to the workers? And how do you design your capital structure to do that? That may be far more specific than the question that's being asked, but it's recognizing that, again, if you think of those two loops that I showed, we're living in that space between the peak of the old and the lowest point of the new. And so we actually need to borrow some of the tools and reframe them through the different belief systems. And so all the experiments, when people say, do you work with banks and do you work with investment advisors and wealth advisors and wealthy people? I'm like, of course I do. But I do them under a redefined set of structures and covenants, including legal covenants that bind our use of capital to closing the racial wealth divide. So again, how do we interface with some of the tools of the dominant system, because we need the resources of it to redirect to the emergence of the new?
Great. Any thoughts, Edgar or Malika, if you want to jump in on here?
I mean, That was brilliant, Deborah. And I mean, I will just add that I think often these types of conversations can be very heady and up here. So regardless of what type of organization you're working in, whether you're a small nonprofit running a program, there are ways to, there are decision points like that we all have every day that can help advance, equity and racial equity in the work that we're doing. So one is whatever problem you're trying to solve, you got to racialize that problem. So how is the problem disproportionately impacting people of color? And then examine your strategies. And, are you actually advancing strategies, closing that gap and those disparities? But look at your staff, look at your board. How are you accountable to communities of color if you're white? And so there are bits and pieces of this conversation that I think could play out in your organization and the decisions that you're making every single day, regardless of your size.
Great.
I have a couple of thoughts on this. One, as we move from where we are to this more idealized society that we'd like to create, there are many contradictions that we have to hold. For example, I am opposed to the pillar of capitalism, one of the pillars of capitalism, which is private land ownership. But at the same time, I realize within the context of the current system, for farmers, the only way to have security is to own the land that you're farming on. And so this is just an example of the many contradictions that we have to hold as we move from where we are to where we like to be. And also, I'll introduce some terms that aren't as popular now as they were perhaps when I became involved in the movement, and that's reform and revolution. And so many of the things we're doing now could be characterized as reformist actions. But the thing is, reformist actions can lead to more revolutionary actions depending on how it's framed. If we're only looking at reformist actions in terms of we're trying to get the streetlights turned on or we're trying to, reduce hunger, that doesn't necessarily lead to a fundamental change in power. But if we frame it so that people see these as being necessary steps towards building community self-determination, then these kind of incremental reformist changes can lead to a more fundamental change.
Great. Malik, there was a question specifically for you about Black-owned banks and the role that they're playing, or whether in fact you've been able to work with them.
Well, our organization has our account is with a predominantly Black-owned bank, and of course, banks usually have stockholders, so very few things that sell stock are 100% Black. But the thing is, Black capitalism is not going to save Black people. Let me be clear about that. There may be, some value in having Black banks that are able to hold some of the wealth from Black people and to, to distribute that wealth. But Black banks are subject to the same kind of logic of financing that white-owned banks are. So I'm much more interested in cooperative ventures rather than kind of just replicating the dominant capitalist system in blackface.
Got it. Thanks. So there were a couple questions that were about, not surprising that 70% of the people on this call are from nonprofits. So about grants, and so there was one question about on sort of a positive side, how do I have a conversation about decolonizing wealth without jeopardizing my funding? And then sort of on a different aspect, there was a question about, how do I avoid in my grant applications becoming a practitioner of what is sometimes called poverty porn. So anyone want to jump in on either of those?
I'll just make a brief statement and say that I think the basis of this, and I think Deborah spoke to this earlier, is being clear on our own values and being true to our own values. We have to always start from that. And it's very easy to experience mission drift, to see that there's grants out there for various things and you start kind of morphing your organization to go after these funds. We never do that. We would advise people not to do that, to stay true to your mission, to stay true to your values, and to find funding that aligns with that, rather than doing some kind of funny dances to obtain funding.
Yeah, fair enough. Edgar, I think this is a question for you. It came from somebody who's working at a community health center, and they're trying to, be informed by practices of racial equity and do trauma-informed care. And the reality is that the funding isn't always there for trauma-informed care. Actually doing trauma-informed care, surprise, requires resources. How should folks in this situation, think about it and respond?
Well, I mean, I've been out of public health for a while, but I mean, I feel like I think that even outside of philanthropy where I'm working and other places like healthcare, trauma is informing everything. I think that even with medicine and supporting well-being and healthcare, that trauma has a role to play. The socioeconomic determinants of health are really, I think public health and healthcare were at the forefront of understanding the intersectionality of poverty and education and race being a indicator or predictor of one's success. So yeah, I mean, I think I started as a health funder. I think health foundations in this country have probably been ahead of most of philanthropy in understanding the connections of all these issues. So I would find a funder that gets it and see if they can be your ambassador to some potential funding.
And I guess there are about 300 health conversion foundations or hospitals. The group called Grant Makers in Health comes to mind. Malika, I'll have you have the last question, then we'll need to close out. So there was a question about food deserts and gentrification, and how do we close the gap on food deserts in cities that are experiencing gentrification?
First of all, I never used the term food desert. I stopped using that many years ago. It's problematic for me for multiple reasons.
Mm-hmm.
One, like the term at-risk child. I used to be an educator and used to run a school, and I never heard a parent who referred to their own child as an at-risk child. These are terms that are imposed on communities from the outside. And so if we support the principle of community self-determination, a fundamental aspect of community self-determination is self-definition. We have to be able to define our own problems, our own challenges. And so this term food desert was not a term that people who are food insecure coined to define their situation. It was a term that for the most part was imposed upon communities. Also, a desert is really a very vibrant ecosystem. And so I don't think that it really describes what we're thinking about when people use that term, food desert. But again, there's a certain logic to capitalism. And what we see is that grocery stores tend to locate in areas that have population density and have more affluence. And so that has spelled out in Detroit and other urban areas. What that's looked like is grocery stores abandoning those areas that are losing population and moving into areas that are more population dense. And so there's definitely a relationship between both the loss of grocery stores and depopulation, and then in more recent times, the building of new grocery stores, sometimes things like Whole Foods in areas that are being highly gentrified. In fact, sometimes one of the symbols that a neighborhood is being gentrified is usually first the Starbucks opens and then followed shortly by a Whole Foods.
Fair enough. Okay, and thanks. And obviously you're right about Malika about deserts being an impressive ecosystem. So we'll try to be cognizant of that going forward. So there's so much more and more questions that we'll try to follow up with after the webinar. But I wanted to close on time. So I'll thank Gar Alperovitz, by an extension for his participation in the interview, and in person, Maliki Kenyatta, Debra Fries, and Edgar Villanueva. So our contact information is below, and as we mentioned at the start of the webinar, we will make the slides available as well as links to other handouts and information. So thanks again. Remember, our next webinar in the series will be on Thursday, December 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern, same time, second Thursday of the month, and we'll be talking about community ownership of land and the challenges of making sure that the resource of land is equitably distributed and the benefits of that go to the broad community of people throughout the country. So thanks again for being here, and look forward to staying in touch as we go through this entire series. Bye now.